Welcome everyone to the UCL ERIC seminar today. My name is Tejendra Ferali. I'm Professor of Education, Conflict and Peace at the IOE University College London. I'm also Research Co-Director for the ERIC Research Program. The ERIC Research Consortium focuses on educational research in a number of conflict-affected contexts, and we've been working in South Sudan, and of course, in many other six other countries that you may have heard from us in the previous seminars. The focus of the research program is to produce policy relevant and actionable research that can help educational practitioners, ministries of education, and donors to be able to inform their educational programming and to address access, quality, continuity, and coherence of education in these settings. This seminar is particularly to bring together a dialogue between the ERIC research and the research studies that other colleagues might be conducting in other settings to really help us develop our knowledge and understanding of educational problems, but also to identify potential solutions that could mitigate some of these challenges in educational delivery in these settings. So what we have done in this seminar is really sort of given half an hour for like dialogue, for discussion and comments from colleagues, unlike in other seminars, so that we will leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So we had a brief pause in the series after September because colleagues were busy conducting their field work, but also we had a few conferences going on. Now we are back in, and we will be coming to you with additional seminar presentations in the months to come. Today's seminar particularly focuses on different types of educational barriers faced by learners in some students. As you will hear from colleagues shortly, they will be talking about sort of multi-layered barriers at different sort of levels, national, subnational, and community levels. And our studies underpin a political economy lens to be able to understand these barriers. And colleagues will be presenting on the ongoing studies, some of the studies they've already completed, and we will be able to also listen to, hopefully, from Dr. Ador, who will be providing some critical comments and thoughts on our study. So the first presenter is Alifrida Talihi, who is a senior education manager with IRC in South Sudan. And Alifrida is quite experienced in research and program support focusing on teacher development, foundational learning, and inclusion in crisis-affected contexts. She's also a co-author of the ERIC study on barriers to education. Our second speaker is Lokuri Moses. Lokuri is a research manager with Otherwise Research in South Sudan. And Lokuri is a research specialist with over a decade of experience conducting qualitative and quantitative research in South Sudan, is part of the ERIC research team. And then our third presenter is Marty Scott, who is Senior Assessment Officer with REACH. And she focuses on education in emergencies and conducts assessments in underreported and rapidly evolving crises across the country. wherever there is a risk of severe humanitarian outcomes for affected populations. Marty's work spans multiple sectors, and she has contributed to assessments that intersect with education needs and access in emergency settings. So we're going to start with a first presentation by Elifrida and Lokiri, and then we will move to Marty. And both presentations have 10 minutes each, and then we will move to Dr. Ador for 6 minutes comments, and then we will move to Q&A. Over to you, Elifrida.
Thank you, Tejendra. Just confirm if you can see my slides.
Yes, we can see the PowerPoint, but if you could put that in a presentation mode. Yeah,
Yeah,
perfect.
I just did.
Thank you.
Coming. Yes. So hello everyone. So for this presentation, as Tejendra highlighted, it's exploring the barrier to education in South Sudan, the poly-crisis context, but also showing how challenges across the system, schools, and the community level are interconnected. It's also highlight how different stakeholders prioritize these barriers different, pointing to the need of for coordinated context responsive solutions. South Sudan education system is within the poly-crisis system, and it's shaped by conflict, climate shocks, and economic pressure. While there has been some progress, such as improved gender parities, we have observed improvement on data system, and also we have observed increased budget allocation to education sector. The execution and implementation of this remain a key challenge. These gains exist alongside persistent issues, including there's over 2.8 million children out of school, teacher shortages, and ongoing disruptions. Barriers are deeply interconnected, making difficult prioritization more difficult, especially across diverse local contexts. And alike, this complexity underscores the importance of evidence-based research and sustained dialogue to inform more context-responsive policies and programs. For this research, we have two main objectives. The first one is to identify the key barriers to education in South Sudan as it's perceived by local stakeholders, particularly looking into factors that are affecting access, quality, and continuity of learning. And second, to understand the root cause behind these barriers, including issues related to system coherence and the broader political economy shaping the education sector. More important, we have been working very closely in partnership with the Ministry of General Education and Instruction and involving other education actors with the aim of generating actionable insights to inform policy and programming. The analysis was done back in October, November 2023. It's done based on the data that was collected in November, October 2023. And this was done in Central Equatoria, Northern Balgazar, and Upper Nile State. And it involved a vast majority of stakeholders involving national and subnational government officials, program actors from INGO and UN, but also grassroots stakeholders, including teachers, head teachers, parents, and CSOs. In this slide, we present the perceived barriers to education identified by stakeholders in our study. The finding highlight that teachers-related challenges and inadequate infrastructure or learning spaces emerge as the most frequent cited barriers. These are followed by poverty, conflict, insecurity, and social and cultural dynamics affecting schools, particularly for girls. Stakeholders also pointed to distance to schools, limited learning material, and broader system and inclusive issues as additional to the constraints. Overall, this is finding showing that the barrier across multiple levels, community, contextual policies, and structure, reinforcing the complexity of addressing the educational challenges in South Sudan. We went further by looking on how the perceived barriers vary per location and also respondent types. On the left side of the slide, we can see across different states, the identification of barriers fairly consistent with teachers' issues, infrastructure challenges, and also poverty emerging as common concern across contexts. This suggests that many of the core challenges facing education are shared across location rather than highly context specific. However, when you look on the right, we observe some variation across respondent groups. So for instance, the government respondent tend to highlight system and infrastructure issues more strongly, while a grassroots respondent bring out community level challenges such as poverty and social cohesion or dynamics, while the program actors tend to emphasize on teachers' issues and learning conditions. Overall, the main barriers are largely consistent across the states, but different stakeholders prioritize them different depending on first their roles and also their perspective. And this is telling us it's very important of capturing views from multiple levels of education system when setting priorities in education. Here we are highlighting two critical constraints that have been highlighted, looking into teacher-related challenges and infrastructure limitations. On the teacher side, stakeholder consistent pointed to low and often delayed salaries, limited access to education, to teacher training, and heavy reliance on volunteer teachers, mostly supported by community rather than the government itself. And also this factor contributes to low motivation, poor attrition, and challenges in maintaining teaching quality. On the infrastructure side, many schools lack adequate classroom and wash facilities, and in some areas, teaching still taking place under trees or in temporary structures. This infrastructure gap also contributes to significant inequality in access, particularly in remote and pastoralist communities. And more importantly, poor infrastructure and limited facilities excessively affecting girls, children with disability, and learners that require additional support. And it's highlighting the strong link between infrastructure quality, inclusion, and equitable access to education. This is a quick snapshot of the infrastructure challenges on the ground. And with that, I will hand over to Lokiri to proceed.
Thank you, Frida. And having looked at the barriers that affect the access, quality, and the continuity of the education system, I'll take you through the perceived reasons behind their persistence. Because understanding this root causes is the first step towards lasting solutions. Across the stakeholders highlighted several interconnected factors in 4 dimensions: governance, emergence, community, and the assistance level. General, we see that the governance-related barriers are the most significant, but 3 issues stand out, in particular: insufficient national education funding, limited community ownership or negative attitude towards education, and the ongoing insecurity and the conflict, which continue to disrupt education systems. Next. So in this slide, on the left, we present the perceived reasons for the persistence of barriers by location, while on the right, we show the same by respondent type. Across locations, we see that beyond insufficient budget and the limited community ownership, there is relatively little consensus on the root causes of the education barriers. Unlike in the identification of the barriers, where we saw that there was consistent approach, but when we look at the root causes of these barriers, then we start seeing that there's a limited consensus across the different stakeholders at the different levels. This highlights a significant center-peripheral disconnect between the national and the subnational stakeholders. National stakeholders in particular tend to emphasize on insufficient budget, misaligned donor support, and poverty as the key drivers of the persistent barriers. In contrast, we see that subnational stakeholders are more focused on the budget implementation issues or challenges, issues related to insecurity and the conflict, and the conflict-related, climate-related shocks and the coordination issues. Notably, we see that the stakeholders in northern Baragazan and the Upper Nile, which are more remote from the national government centers, specifically highlight budget implementation issues, pointing to the gaps between resource allocation and the actual delivery on ground. Now, when we look at on the right, in terms of the respondent types, we see that the Ministry of General Education and the instruction respondents in dark green tend to focus more on system-level constraints, particularly budget limitations and the donor alignment. Whereas grassroots actors emphasizes on issues related to insecurity, climate shock, and the community-level challenges. For program staff, they provide a more balanced perspective, highlighting both systemic, such as budget and governance, and the operational and the social barriers, which includes community ownership and the inclusion. Next. In order to understand well the disconnect between the subnational and the national, in terms of identifying the reasons behind these barriers, we look at the community attitude as one of the key barriers that came up, and the governance side. So when we look at the community side, education is sometimes perceived as a low priority, particularly in the pastoralistic community context. However, respondents consistently link these attitudes to a deeper structural issues, including things related like poverty, hunger, and the concerns about school and teacher quality. This suggests that what is often framed as a community problem is really rooted in the broader socio-economic constraints that faces these communities. Whereas on the governance side, we see that the center-peripheral difference becomes even more clearer in this slide. At the national level, respondents were focusing mainly on budget allocation, while at the subnational levels, concerns shifted to how the budgets are actually implemented in their allocations. Key challenges that were highlighted include limited clarity on accountability and the oversight, as well as persistent gaps in coordination, leadership, and execution. Whereas there was an acknowledgement that there are mechanisms in place, such as the Education Transfer Monitoring Committee, which are seen as a positive step towards monitoring this process. The respondent emphasizes that the actual implementation of such policies is remain an issue. Next. So in our analysis, we attribute the difference in administration of the process to the vertical arrangement of the education system with limited peripheral center feedback mechanism. In South Sudan, as we know, many education barriers are expressed at the peripheral level, that's at the school level, the state, and the community level, while key decisions around budget, strategies, and the resources remain concentrated at the center of the national level.
Yep. So, luckily, you probably need to wrap up now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This reflects what I can move to the next slide. So we try to analyze the two, what the current system and what we think will be a more responsive system. We think that we think that you see on the left is a slide of what we think is the current system where decisions are made at flows from the central government to the peripheral, and the feedback comes from the school tend to weaken in the process and then do not reach the central government. But we think that for the South Sudan system to work well, the feedback from the community and the school levels need to reach the central point. And although the system is in place, we think improvement on the feedback mechanism from the community to the central government would go a long way in curbing these barriers. In conclusion, therefore, we find that the stakeholders across the different localities identify similar key barriers, particularly teacher-related challenges and inadequate school infrastructure. However, there is some variation depending on the type of the respondent and their institution perspective. We also observe the greater difference in how stakeholders interpret the root causes of the barriers, particularly between national and subnationals, pointing to the disconnect between the center and the peripheral. Governance issues, especially budget allocation and execution, alongside insecurity and the community attitude, are frequently seen as the underlying drive. Overall, our analysis suggests that the radio structure of the education system limits feedback and the local agents, allowing barriers to become self-perpetuating over time. Thank you. And
okay. Thank you, Lukuri. That's wonderful. That's very rich analysis and findings presented from the ERICC study. Now, can I invite Marty to share her PowerPoint and do the presentation?
Yes, hello, thank you so much. Let me share my... Okay.
Yeah.
I hope you can see my
Yeah, we
slide.
can. Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. So hello, everyone.
Presentation mode, Marty, if that's possible. Perfect.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maartje Schots. I'm an analyst working with ERICC initiative in South Sudan. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. For those who aren't familiar with ERICC, this is one of the initiatives under impact initiatives. And at ERICC, we conduct assessments to inform the humanitarian response and policy decisions. Here in South Sudan, our portfolio includes work on food security, emergencies, public health, market monitoring, and different types of needs analysis. So while we don't have an established work stream about education in South Sudan, many of our assessments do include an educational component. And at a global level, we also have been involved in the analysis of education data from the multi-sectoral needs assessment, and in South Sudan's case, the intersectoral needs assessment, which is conducted by IOM. This has led to the production of a dashboard, which presents findings on education in emergencies, which I'll get back to later as well. So in this presentation, I will highlight some key findings related to education from various of our assessments. For the sake of time, I will not dive deeply into each of these different assessments, but all of them are published on our research center. And then I've included hyperlinks to the slide deck as well, and I'm happy to share that after this presentation. So first, I'd like to start by highlighting our flood impact mapping, which we did in October of last year, where we assessed the impact of floods on the access to services and service infrastructure in some of the most flood-affected counties in South Sudan. So before I go into the map on this slide here, just a few words on the methodology. We used spatial overlay analysis to identify potentially flooded villages and facilities. So we mapped population centers using a combination of building footprints data and contour population data, which we also verified by our own population mapping exercise. And then we overlaid this with FuseNet's flood detection data from September 2025 to identify flooded population centers. We then also used IOM's village assessment survey data from 2025 to map educational facilities, health facilities, water points, and administrative buildings. So again, we overlaid this with the flood detection data, and all facilities within 100 meters of the flood perimeter were identified as flooded. So we did this for 6 flood-affected counties. For each, we produced 5 maps. So one with population and high grounds, then one for education facilities, one for health, one for water points, and one for administrative buildings. And on the slide here, you see the flood impact map of Mayendit County for education facilities. So based on our analysis, using the thresholds I just mentioned, we found the following. As you can see on the slide here, we found that 73% of the population in Mayendit was flood affected. And we also found that 83% of the education facilities was flood affected, meaning within 100 meters of the flood perimeter. So like I mentioned, we produced similar maps for other flood-affected counties as well, for Leer, Koch, Gwit, Panjshir, and Nasser. So for the sake of time, I will not go into each of these separately, but as you can see here, flooding had a significant impact on the access to education in these counties, with the proportion of affected facilities reaching from about a third in Nasser to over 4 in 5 facilities in Gwit and Panjshir. So the flood impact mapping shows the impact of flooding on the physical access to education, and how access to education can be significantly disrupted, particularly in the rainy season. So as I mentioned before, 33 to 84% of education facilities in the assessed counties were potentially affected by flooding. And this also aligns to data from last year's ISNA. For example, in Jonglei State, 50% of in-schools children education was disrupted by natural hazards in the school year 2024-2025. Of course, other public services are affected as well. Like I mentioned, we also created maps for health facilities, water points, and administrative buildings, which all can be found on our resource center. So in parallel to flooding, the escalation of violence since last year in South Sudan has also caused new waves of displacement, which then also disrupts the physical access to education. So of course, the way this happens is firstly very intuitive. When populations move, they might move away from physical education infrastructure. But secondly, some of our findings also show that conflict-related displacement affects the access to education for host communities and not just for displaced persons. So again, based on data from last year's ISNA, almost 1 child out of 3 has seen their education disrupted by displaced populations using school facilities as shelters. And in other cases, conflict elsewhere might make education unavailable for populations who are not displaced by the violence themselves. This is something that we found in an assessment that we conducted last year in Bazia, which is a remote area in the south of Wau County, close to the border of Najero County. So last year, when violence escalated in Najero, about 16,000 IDPs were displaced from Najero to Wau. And we found that due to a lack of education in this remote part of Wau, host communities in Bazia had been sending their children to school in Najero before the violence. So the escalation of violence in Najero then meant that these education facilities became unavailable, not just for the population who was displaced from Najero, but also for the host communities in Bazia. So altogether, this shows that education needs, as well as the access to education in South Sudan, are shaped by overlapping crises, particularly flooding and conflict. So these dynamics hindering physical access to education are also represented in data on main barriers to education as well. So for example, the closure of schools due to natural disasters was the main reason why 13.5% of school-age children did not attend school in the year 2024-2025. This is again based on data from last year's ISNA. And furthermore, the lack of appropriate and accessible schools was the second most reported barrier, which is also mentioned in the presentation before. And this also aligns to the findings I just discussed about Bazia and WOW. So the lack of appropriate and accessible schools is most stark in remote areas, where 1 in 5 children does not go to school due to lack of appropriate and accessible schools. And for comparison, this is the highest percentage out of the 16 contexts of the global education analysis that was ran by ERICC in 2025, based on data from the MSNAs and ISNAs. However, the main barrier of access to education was not being able to afford the direct costs. As you can see here, this was the main reason for half of school-age children not to attend school in the school year of 2024-2025. And this is something we hear quite frequently in our qualitative research as well. For example, in a 2025 assessment about the integration of female returnees from Sudan, as well as in an assessment about the impact of economic hardship on market-dependent households that we conducted in 2024. So in the latter, we conducted focus group discussions in which participants often mentioned that they would drop children out of school completely. And some of them emphasized that this does not only cut school fees from household expenses, but also makes more household members available for income-generating activities. So then finally, I'm almost done. I wanted to quickly reflect on what our data shows about the perceived importance of education among South Sudanese. So as we all know, South Sudan is a severe humanitarian context with a high proportion of acutely food insecure and malnourished people, volatile economy, high unemployment rates, and very limited access to healthcare. So even though at ERICC, we mainly conduct humanitarian focused research, so mostly focusing on immediate life-threatening needs and potential risk of excess mortality, the importance of education in the perceptions of South Sudanese is a recurring theme in many of our assessments. So for example, as is shown on the right here, in the same 2024 assessment about economic hardship, education was consistently identified as one of the most important needs across the 4 locations. This was clear from both the quantitative data, as is shown in the figure here, but also in the FGDs we conducted. And this was despite the quite severe levels of food insecurity that we found in the same study based on several food security indicators. And lastly, this quote on the left of your slide is from an AAP study we conducted in 2023, which looks into the integration of displaced communities. Here we found that access to education was an important component of displaced persons' perceptions on their own level of integration. And such findings indicate the importance of education in durable solution strategies as well. So yeah, with this, I've come to the end. Like I mentioned before, I've included links to all the assessments I've referenced in this presentation. So I'm happy to share this slide deck as well. For now, thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Marty. That's wonderful. That's a very rich data and presentation there. So I'm just looking at the participant list. My sense is that Dr. Ador is not here.
He's in.
No, I am here. I'm trying to struggle with the internet, but I am here.
Oh, okay. So Dr. Ador, we are running out of time, so maybe I was gonna bring you in a bit more during the discussion. Would you mind maybe just making a few comments at this point, based on what colleagues have presented, and then we could have your further thoughts when we move into the Q&A. Just if you could, in a couple of minutes, share some of your reflections on what colleagues have presented, that would be really helpful. Over to you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. And just confirm if you can hear me, because I'm joining from my phone. It's raining heavily in Juba, and just trying to be sure that I wasn't locked out. Thank you so much. So my name is Ador Riak, and I work for a network called National Education Coalition. It's a network of advocates that support advocacy on education in South Sudan. I also do academic work at the Upper Nile University as a faculty member, faculty of education. And so just to reflect a little bit on the data and the research, presentation that have been made by colleagues, I think we now have a good understanding of the picture of where we are in South Sudan. So if we talk of that the population in South Sudan continue to be out of school, continue to be illiterate, we currently have about 34.5% of the population being illiterate, being literate, you now understand the factors, you now understand the reasons, and the reasons from the data that has been presented can be put into forward perspective. One being political related issues, second being economical related issues, third being issues to do with environment, and the last one could be issues related to, administrative management. And so from the data that is presented, you find that the community has low opinion on education because of issues of poverty, or maybe they made of role models in their communities. You begin to find that children continue to be out of the school because teachers have not been paid salary. They don't come to classes. They don't go to school. You continue to hear that, you have no access to a particular school because it has rained heavily. Fighting has occurred. People have been displaced. They cannot go back to those classes. And so the picture that has been painted here, it's a gloomy picture of what it is in South Sudan. The sample that has been made, it is true of the definition of what is happening across the country in South Sudan. But of course, when you looked at all this at the end, you will not just talk about the resources. It's not about the resources. It all goes back to systemic failure of the authorities that should be taking charge, that should be putting, mitigating factors in place, for example. You looked at issues of financing. You continue to have education being underfunded. In the current budget, you cannot imagine just 1.7% of annual budget is being put into education. You want to put back 2.8 children in school. You want to rebuild classrooms. You want to train teachers. You want to pay. You cannot do this with this budget that you continue to see from the authorities that are concerned. Of course, communities have been uprooted. They are not where they are supposed to be, so that they can cultivate, they can finance their education. And so, generally, in a nutshell, the issues that have been presented by this research are concrete issues that need concrete solutions, and these solutions can only come when we have a shared responsibility. For example, partnership, humanitarian organization, government, communities, people working in education, to continue to bring resources together, for example, so that you have a centralized point of planning, so that you don't have the Minister of Education sitting down to say, hey, I'm going to do this in Panyajar. No, it should come from Panyajar. What needs to be done? So that becomes very relevant. You don't find someone in Morobo County being told, go and train teachers. The needs have to be relevant to the local context. And this call for, continued research, just like colleagues have done, so that we have real issues that we'll need to raise with our leaders. I think that's where I would want to come in from. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. That's very helpful. I think overall we kind of got a clear sense of the kind of barriers that children and education communities are facing in South Sudan, ranging from the funding shortages to the lack of infrastructure, security challenges, economic challenges, and so forth. And I think Dr. Odor also pointed out the real sort of issue of insufficient education financing from the government. I think that's quite worrying. But overall, I think the presentations highlighted quite complex systemic issues. Basically creating this condition of polycrisis. We got displacement, you got insecurity, and then you got flooding and economic challenges and fighting going on and so forth. And I think we know quite a lot around the kinds of challenges communities are facing. But one of the things that ERICC is quite keen on promoting is to develop some of the solutions that are being trialed, that are being promoted at the community level, at the national level, and so forth. And I'm sure there are a lot of colleagues here who are involved in research in South Sudan in other conflict and emergency contexts. So I would welcome colleagues to share their thoughts and also pose questions to our presenters so that we can have a good discussion in the rest of the time. Please do feel free to raise your hand, turn your camera on if you can, and give a brief intro who you are and which organization you are based in, and share your comment or question briefly. Okay. Any questions or any comments?
Chandra, we have one question in the standard chat and another question in the Q&A separate function.
Right. Okay. So thanks for that, Ariana. So I think we've got a question around, shall we bring this discussion especially related to girls with disability? And that's an important question. I think Alifreda and colleagues, if you would like to comment on the issue of girls with disabilities and how they face different kinds of barriers as compared to other types of learners in South Sudan.
Thank you, Tejendra. I think as we have highlighted in our presentation, we do see a common different levels of barriers as being perceived at location level and also depending on the actors. But an overall, there is a recognition that children with disability and particularly girls also, they are affected much with those challenges. First of all, being in school trained with untrained teacher, so engagement of girls and children with disability become more difficult. We also saw the issues of infrastructure. Majority of infrastructure under tree, semi-permanent, or they are submerged somewhere, and they are not developing a friendly environment for children with disability, but also with limited wash facility. We do observe, and also there was a complete agreement with stakeholders that girls are more affected and more likely contributing to them not being able to access schools. So this, I think, poses a point of discussion as Dr. Dole highlighted. It's need to have collective police advocacy, but also not only police advocacy, but making sure implementation are being done at the grassroots so that learners and teachers are benefiting from what we are seeing. Thank you.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Elifrida. So there's another question from Nick, which is quite interesting in the sense that the ERICC study pointed out that education was highly prioritized among communities, but also we saw in the ERICC study that attitude towards education within communities was one of the barriers, one of the causes for persistence of barriers to education. So how do we sort of reflect on the one hand, communities prioritize education. On the other hand, there may be some communities where the attitude to education maybe not enthusiastic. I think, yeah. So any thoughts, any comments from colleagues based on their experiences or from our presenters? Maybe, I don't know, Nick, did you have any thoughts yourself? Or was it a kind of a provocation? You may have some thoughts. Rose, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, colleagues, for your presentation. It was enlightening and also has a lot that we can use and learn from as we continue to design projects. I'm Rose Wahome. I work for IRC as the East Africa Regional Education Advisor. And so I do take part a lot in designing new projects, but also in supporting ongoing one. And especially that disconnect between the national level and the community level or the school level, so to speak, is something that I can say has been persistent and has been there for at least the long time that I have worked and been in South Sudan. And sometimes it is something that is a tension that is normally difficult even when we design new projects, because on the one hand, you know for sure that the teachers need support to be able to deliver. And so we know that they are not being paid regularly, as Frida said. And we know that also the working conditions or the school environment is not as friendly, because I have seen many a times in South Sudan where teachers are using under the tree as their staff room. And so there is all those. But then on the other hand, we have the donor saying they cannot pay they cannot pay teacher incentives because that is the role of the government. And so just listening to this presentation today, it really does bring to life the reality and the struggles that are faced by the education sector in South Sudan. And I just wanted to add my comment to say that it does reflect the reality that is there. And it is good that these points are also being raised so that continuous advocacy can be done. It's good that different donors are now coming up with all these modalities, like the requirement for government to pay teachers a certain percent for them to unlock certain funding and things like that. And so all these efforts are really going to be useful and important. The one thing that, and I think Lokiri was touching on it, is also the behavior of the community and the things that we need to do so that communities can, of course, communities embrace education. They support. I know that in many schools, they are the ones who are sustaining the volunteer teachers. But it is also true that in some cases, the community may not see education as being so important, because they are seeing that some children will go to school and not have any opportunities for employment or business or things like that. And so it is really, as I was just listening throughout this presentation, it was just bringing to light all these challenges. But
Yeah.
I think the bigger question for us is how then can we use these findings from this work to be able to push for more, for more progress, and especially towards making it possible for teachers to get paid and be paid on time, and then the environment so that children can study in a good and safe place. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. That was very helpful. So there are a couple of other questions on. One is on the opportunities for online learning and online education in South Sudan from Gabi. Elifrida, Marcy, or Lokiri, do you have any comments on the opportunity around online education or the use of education technology in addressing some of these barriers potentially?
I will respond in general, Gabby. Thank you for that, but I think it's require more in-depth support. There has been efforts from different stakeholders, also particularly UNESCO, on improving EdTech interventions in South Sudan. However, infrastructural challenges and perception still persist on those areas, and it's something that is coming in. But also IRC and other partners are also exploring opportunities to create this, whether online or offline, based on the assessment that are being done. Offline are much more recommended, and it has a lot of things. That's what I'm saying. It need more discussion because it has a challenge of its own. Happy to continue this discussion with you. But I will just end up for now. But also you can reach out to UNESCO. They also have some intervention.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Now, there's one more question around so colleagues have presented the whole range of barriers, but what may be the short-term or long-term or medium-term solutions to some of these barriers? I think this is from Yuan. It relates to the question, I mean, the comment I made earlier around how do we start thinking about these potential solutions? Are there some solutions or responses from communities that are working to address these barriers? Any thoughts from the presenters?
Lokiri, do you
Okay,
want to
can I
go
come
with
in?
this? Yes, Dr. Dor.
Thank you. Thank you. I think the issue around the solutions on what can be done, it's a tough one. It's a tough one for a situation or a context like South Sudan. But I think if the approach would be sitting together, planning together, looking at these issues that we have raised or this particular research have raised, if stakeholders, the government, communities, donors sit together and plan together so that we are able to say, for example, if the issues that are too much prominence are issues related to security, can the government and the stakeholders in the peace agreement sit down and really decide and say, our people have suffered enough, can we really continue to have them suffer? Can we bring them together and and focus more so that we can have peace around among our communities, so that we have people moving freely across the country. You have children going to school. You have the issue of the children with disabilities that we were talking around before. A lot of it is to do with community perception or cultural bondages that can be. So I think the issues around what need to be done are much more into, can we sit together and plan together, other than just having one entity sitting down and plan for other people. The other thing is, when you have planned together, can we empower the communities so that issues of coordination, we coordinate, we empower the communities, the chiefs, the local leadership, so that they are given the power to be able to identify, for example, which children are not going to school, why. Then we are able to bring those issues together and resolve them. I think those could be some of the solution. Of course, as we said earlier, advocacy is not an easy thing. People need to continue to advocate, to highlight these issues with the government, with the international community. Given the current, donor dynamics, a lot of people are going back to their countries. Back to their own planning. Can our government, can the local government, can the communities take charge, of the destiny issues? Why education is no longer a priority? It has been mentioned. You go to school, you graduate, you don't find a job. It's better you go do farming or look after cattle. Those are some of the perceptions that need to people to continue to talk on and dialogue on. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, Dr. Odor. I was also hoping to come to you about the kind of barrier that you identified in relation to more kind of politicization and deprioritization of education financing, in the government. In the next 1 minute, could you reflect on how this lack of priority for education financing in the government can be shifted?
I think there's a bit of a double standard from the government. Education is a key priority from the policy document. You'll find education is key, number one, number two, number three, and everything else. But when it comes to resourcing the sector, you find no one is putting resources there. So I think I think what needs to be done, and this is part of what we continue to advocate on at the coalition at our own spaces, is to really bring the importance and the advantages of a working capital, a resource capital that is able to looking at in the next 20 years, in the next 30 years, where do we want to go as a country? We cannot go to where we want to be if we are not educating our own population. If we're looking for resources from outside the country, we can. So the only solution is, using our own domestic resources by the government, put the taxes into education, tax the people more, of course, and put them into education. But then the other challenge that we've even seen now is no longer about the little resource that comes. Is that little resource that is said, the 1.7 will not even come. The execution is another big problem in the country. So we continue to say, the more you begin to say education is a priority, can you even prioritize to put in, to release that money that you have said that you're putting in? Our own sector plan, I don't know whether you're able to see, not sector plan, Education Act. This act says at least 10% of education budget should be put into education. That does not come, and you want to have a population that is educated to reach Korea, to reach Singapore, to be the U. It's not possible, and these are the realities that we tell the government. And of course, when we find findings from such reports, we're able now to present to the government and say, this is the reality. The reality is only in financing. It's only increasing, using money in putting them in the right places. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that final thought. We are coming to the end of the seminar. So I think we saw that there are challenges at different levels, at political level, at systemic level, of course, but also a number of challenges at the community level in relation to the infrastructure, lack of teachers who are qualified to support, but also teachers facing all kinds of challenges themselves, and accessibility to the schools that are available. So I think these sets of presentations have really provided us this picture of real challenge that education community faces in South Sudan, and I think we should continue to engage in dialogue. And ERICC is involved in research, and many more outputs will be coming along in the months to come. And we will continue to have these discussions as part of the seminar series. I would like to thank you all for joining our event today, and also I would like to thank Nayun for the support, and Sri Raman from INEE, and of course Dr. Vanessa Ozawa for putting the seminar together. And we will see you next time. Until then, goodbye.